unless you are speaking. All right, well, let me just for a second here set the afternoon for us. You know, we are here mostly because Jackie said, hey, Amanda, I think you and John should do this. Jackie is the senior pastor of Middle Church and our wonderful leader. But in all seriousness, we are here because I think all of us understand what's at stake right now in this moment and in this election and in our world. We're here because we know that religion, unfortunately, often is used as a tool for justifying the oppression of people who aren't white and who aren't Christian. And in perhaps a more pressing way than ever before, we have a moral responsibility to vote against whiteness and to vote for justice and love and liberation of all people. And we'll talk throughout the afternoon a little bit about what that means and what that can look like. Of course, we understand that, you know, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are not saviors, and they're not God, and they're not Jesus, and we are not expecting that even. But we do agree that they represent the best opportunity to bring about God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. We also are here because we understand that white voters actually could cost Biden the election, and that we have a lot of voting power. We're here because we know that 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump in 2016 and actually then did lose the election for Hillary Clinton. We're here because we know that 53% of white women voted for Trump in 2016. And so our work is before us, and we don't want to be silent and acting like we can be complacent in this moment. At our beginning here, at our gathering, we want to also recognize that a gathering of all white people is also problematic, right? You know, Rob Stevens, some of you remember him from middle, says it best that a gathering of all white people is inherently racist, just because we're all white here. So, and we like to say that this is only therefore part of the work. It should never be the fullness of the work, but just simply a part of the full work that we do in community with all God's people, regardless of how they are raised. And we recognize that we have a continual call to be accountable to Black and Brown and Indigenous and people of color when we do this work. So with all that being said, just a little bit of our goals for the afternoon. One is really just to recommit ourselves to the ongoing work of dismantling white supremacy, to centering people of color and their needs and their desires, and to energizing ourselves in this final week until November 3rd. And finally, to get some real tactical tools and tips about how we talk about politics across lines of difference with people that we love. Raise your hand if that is something that you could use some help with. I know that it is something that I could use some help with. That place in your heart starts like beating really fast, and then you're like, okay, I'm done, I'm out. And Jesse is gonna walk us through all that later on today, aren't you, Jesse? Yes. So
my heart races just as fast as all of yours, but I'll give it a shot.
Thank you, Jesse. So before we go any further, I would like to ask if the Reverend John Janka could open us with a word of prayer.
Sure, thanks. Let's pray together. God of grace and ground of our hope, as we enter this closing time of election season, we pray the outcome will advance democracy and the common good and set us as a nation on the path to healing and greater unity. That the soul of the nation will propel us to greater unity of vision and purpose, equality and justice. That we will be a people worthy of the blessings we have received. And that those blessings may be extended out as we interact with the nations of the world. Bless us in this time of conversation. May we be informed by wisdom and patience and a curiosity to understand one another. All of this we ask in your holy name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, John. And Sally, who also does a lot of this similar type work, put in the chat in a very succinct way what we were hitting on earlier. She says that white affinity groups are a supplement to, not a replacement for, multiracial dialogue and Black and Indigenous-led anti-racism education. Thank you, Alli. So we have asked a couple of conversation partners to join us today. And if you all could just raise your hands right now so that we can see who you are. They're all over the screen with us here. I'm not going to introduce us all right now, but the first time you speak, what I'd love for you to do is just introduce yourself, your pronouns, where you're calling in from today, and whatever type of bio you'd like to give yourself. If it's just energized voter, that's amazing. But if it's something about yourself that you think is specifically relevant to this conversation, feel free to say that as well. And thank you in advance to all our amazing conversation partners for being here. So we're going to get right going. And I would like to start, Tom, with you. And I would love if you could give us an overview of how white voters have historically voted and what the role of the white vote in voting for collective liberation is.
Thanks, Amanda. It's so good to be with y'all. I'm dialing in from Detroit, Michigan right now, and I'm the co-editor of radicaldiscipleship.net, and I was a high school teacher for 18 years in Mission Viejo, California, in South Orange County, in the heart of Reagan country. So I grew up as an evangelical and was a fundamentalist Christian for 20 years. So I call myself a post-evangelical, but still adamantly rooted in the Christian tradition. So yeah, I mean, I will say this: we walked into the General Baker Institute in Detroit last week, and they were handing out bumper stickers that said "Vote, Disrupt, Vote, Disrupt." And I thought it was a beautiful rhythm to think about our role as people of faith and conscience in the United States. That voting is something, and disrupting is also something. Disrupting some really popular notions of what it means to read the Bible and what the Bible says. Disrupting the role of capitalism and white supremacy and patriarchy and how it shapes us in ways that we know not of, and on and on and on. So I definitely see voting as a spiritual practice, but as one spiritual practice of many. And as many of us on this call know, just recently in 2016, every white category in the United States voted for Donald Trump for president, including white women. 53% of white women voted for Trump. But I think one way to narrate the history of the white vote in the United States, one easy way, one simple way, is just a story. I've talked to a few people just recently who say it the same way, and I've heard this from white folks my entire life. They say that something like this: it doesn't matter who the president is. At the end of the year, it's just a matter of maybe $2,000 or $3,000 one way or the other in my bank account. That is, I think, a predominant white way of voting. And of course, there's all sorts of differences for white people. Where I come from in white evangelicalism since the late 70s, white evangelicals have voted for what they call pro-life candidates, right? They're almost virtually solely single party or single issue voters. Same-sex marriage was included in that, from the 90s on. So there's a lot of different ways, but I would argue that the way that white people vote in the history of the United States is based on self-interest, or what they perceive self-interest to be, right? And theologically as a Christian, I would say that completely goes against everything in the Gospels, including today's gospel passage in the lectionary about loving God and loving neighbor. So that, without oversimplifying it, historically we have the data. This is how white folks vote, and I think that is when it comes to the kind of conversations that we're having, one of the first things that I wanted to try to disrupt, just the mentality of that. The second question that Amanda asked was about collaboration and voting towards our collaboration. And I love that Amanda and other organizers of this call use that language, because I think it's huge. One of the ways that my own soul has been rearranged in the last few years, thinking about white supremacy and patriarchy and capitalism, is to think of it to not just as an ally or an accomplice or even somebody in solidarity with Black, Indigenous, and immigrant people, but as somebody who is victimized by white supremacy and patriarchy and capitalism, and how it has malformed my own soul. So I see my life as ahead of me as a healing process, as a liberating process to get free from those principalities and powers. So to have a system, to have a criminal justice system of mass incarceration that hammers and has historically hammered Black people, especially Black men, this shapes me. It shapes my soul. It malforms me in ways that I'm just starting to understand. The same thing with our educational system, the same way with our economic system, and so on and so forth. So I think to think in that way is really important for white folks to get called into the struggle and to see that these things shape all of us.
Tommy, thank you so much. It's given us a lot to think about in the first 10 minutes. Jake, I'd like to pass it to you next, and trust that you'll tell us a little bit about who you are, what brings you to this table too. And I'd love for you to talk about what in your life has challenged your view of whiteness and how that has affected your view of Trump. And also, what do you see Kamala bringing to this conversation that's relevant to the group that's gathered here?
Great, thank you. I've noticed my internet being a little wonky, so hopefully I come through clearly. And I actually do think I can follow up on a couple of things that Tommy was mentioning there at the end. But yeah, first of all, I'm Jake. I use he, him, his pronouns. Zooming in from my wife's church in Wilton, Connecticut, where she's a minister of Christian formation, but we're both closely connected to Middle Collegiate. As well, I'm an English teacher. I teach high school English in Brooklyn at the Berkeley Carroll School. And my background as a student, I have degrees in, I have a Ph.D. in 19th century British poetry, which qualifies me not at all to be part of this conversation. And I don't consider myself to be a very politically savvy thinker. I'm certainly glad to be part of this conversation. I'll try to offer what I can from my knowledge and experience. I think, Tom's point about recognizing himself as a white man as having been victimized by white supremacy, that really resonates with me. James Baldwin is a huge influence on the way that I think about racism and white supremacy. And one of Baldwin's main reframings of the conversation about racism and white supremacy in the 60s in particular was to ask white people to stop looking at Black suffering, stop saying, look how bad Black people have it. Isn't that bad? Don't you feel bad for them? And to say instead, white people need to examine and to look at how they've been damaged by white supremacy. By the way, if you want to take a look at where he does this, you can look at his debate with William F. Buckley Jr. From 1965. It's really compelling. It's on YouTube. The debate topic is, has the American dream been at the expense of Black Americans? And Baldwin says, well, first of all, yes. There's a famous moment where he says, I picked the cotton, I built the railroads for nothing. I created the economy of this country and I got nothing in return. So it was at my literal economic expense. But more importantly, he then shifts the entire debate question in a really important moment where he says, in a way, he says, what happened to white Southerners? And he doesn't mean just Southerners, by the way. Anyone who knows Baldwin knows he's also talking about racism in the North, because he's from New York City. But he says, what happened to white Southerners was worse than what happened to their Black victims. And it's almost a shocking moment. And I don't think it's just rhetorical strategy. I think it is rhetorical debate strategy, but it's the empathy of Baldwin, the way that he was able to see his white oppressors as having been victimized by the same system that he was. So that's that. I'm sorry, I'm rambling about this now, but that to me has been a profound moment. I think those of us that know Ruby Sales know that she also has been talking about the same thing when she asked the question, where does it hurt? To locate where those wounds are. And to ask us very carefully to think about what we're talking about when we talk about white privilege, because I think it is very important to acknowledge and to, where appropriate, apologize and certainly atone for white privilege. But at the same time, we have to ask, is it a privilege for me to be participating in and carrying out this culture of whiteness that's so damaging and poisonous? So to bring me to Trump, I guess, and the election and the vote, I think people sometimes are like, why are you so obsessed with racism? Why are you always talking about white supremacy? Can you just, can we talk about something else? Like, yeah, I would love to. I would love to not talk about racism. I think a lot of Black people would love to not talk about racism too. I think a lot of people of color would love to be not talking about racism every single day. I think that voting for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris helps us to move more in the direction of a day where we're not talking about racism every single day, because we're actually looking at whiteness and we're actually talking about the wounds of whiteness and raising those questions. And I would love to talk more about the nuances of this as well, the nuances of that reframing of the conversation. And then my second thing, I guess, to answer the question about Kamala, and I was enthusiastic about Kamala Harris. Sorry, I think it's weird. I think I've been kind of, sometimes I call her just by her first name, kind of like the debate moderator did that first time. I think there's something racist in that. And anyway, I find myself doing it. But I was enthusiastic about Kamala Harris, but I know that, I have a lot of friends and acquaintances on Facebook who are really, really not very enthusiastic about her. I see people posting stuff like Kamala is an actual cop, which, first of all, she's not an actual cop, but I do understand. I think it's really important. Like, I think there are really compelling reasons why you'd be concerned about her record with criminal justice. And I think that's an important part of her history and identity. But I also think her Asianness and her Blackness are a huge part of the conversation. And it makes me a little uncomfortable to see some of the, like, Kamala was a cop erasing those other elements of her identity. Ruby Sales had a really good post on Facebook where she contextualized Kamala's nomination in the long history going back to the Bandung Conference of 1955 in Indonesia, where newly independent Asian and African countries had a conference to determine their own agency and autonomy as nations away from and apart from Western colonial powers. And Ruby talked about how she sees Kamala living in the legacy of this Afro-Asian alliance. Why I see Kamala bringing that history into this election. Why would we let, why do some of her identities count and others maybe don't, or maybe aren't part of the conversation? So I'm going to be quiet now, but I am enthusiastic about her because I think she brings a whole range of really important identities into ultimately into the White House.
Thanks, Jake. We're so glad that you're here also. And I could have said this, I should have said this at the beginning too. We are going to go, did I say that we're going to go for an hour and a half? I can't remember who I said that to. We're going to go for an hour and a half today. So if you can hang that long, that's great. If you have to pop off, we understand. But this first part is going to be just kind of setting the stage and having some different me popping questions to our conversation facilitators. And then around 3:45, 3:50, we're going to pop into some tactical training pieces, like how do we have these conversations, and then close with Q&A for everybody. So as you're thinking of things that you want to either add or ask, make notes of them, put them in the chat, whatever. So I know we're putting a lot on the table here at the beginning. John Janka, I want to come to you for a little bit. You are an ordained minister. You are married to a Black woman. What is at stake for you in this election? What are you thinking about?
It's hard to narrow that down, Amanda. There's just a lot of things to be thinking about. I should say maybe a bit about myself and my journey, because I wouldn't want to bet any money on this, but I think I might be one of the more senior people in this conversation. And one of my early experiences in my home church as a teenager was that my minister asked if one Sunday I would preach the sermon. That being terrifying enough all by itself, in the sermon, I focused on the Good Samaritan story because at the time it was just about the only thing I knew about the Bible. So I thought that was pretty safe ground for me. And I illustrated the Good Samaritan by referencing Martin Luther King Jr. as one who was caring for others and attempting to bring about change in the interest of justice. And the congregation, after the worship was over, everybody went out and were very kind in greeting me, except for the president of the board of the trustees of the church, who cornered me after everyone else had left the church and really beat me up over that reference and told me I had no right to mention that man's name, who was a communist and a troublemaker, and I should have known better. This was what later I would come to discover had to do with not being white enough. And Tandeka is the author of a book, Not Being White Enough. And she talks there about whiteness being the dominant racial group in the country, determined to continue to be the dominant ethnicity in the country. And I've come to carry those experiences forward and have tried to introduce some of those ideas to others in conversation. Jackie and I, work a lot together around issues of race. When I think about this election coming up, yes, of course, I'm concerned about racial justice. Jackie and I live and breathe and talk about it almost all the time because we experience it together. But I also think that one of the other things at stake for all of us is the future of democracy itself, and whether we will continue to aspire to be a democratic society where justice continues to be an aspiration, where equality continues to be an aspiration for us as a people, where we are committed to seeking the common good and not self-interest alone, which seems to be very much in vogue now, that we are seeking our own benefit, not realizing that we are tied together in a society, and have to find ways to move beyond this hostile, divisive environment in which we live now. So it's a challenge. I looked up some statistics today because one of my other concerns is depending on how this election turns out, will hinge a great deal on what happens to healthcare in this country. Right now, there are reported to be 44 million people with no healthcare. And I think that figure was identified before this pandemic set in, which means that not counted in that number of 44 million are the people who lost their health care through loss of their employment during this pandemic. 44 million people are more than the total population of California. Or the other way to look at it is that they are 44 million people, a larger number than the total population of the state of New York and the state of Florida combined. With more and more people hanging on the edge, having inadequate health care, having to delay going to get health services until the last minute because they can't afford it, which puts their lives in jeopardy. These are fundamental issues for me in how we see and understand ourselves as a people, as a nation, as a community, occupying the same turf, the same environment, the same nation. So what are we going to do in sorting out some of these huge, huge issues? The other one I want to name, because I think it's such a huge problem for us now, is the question of economic justice and wealth disparity. More and more people are being left behind economically. The pandemic has shown how vulnerable we are as a people, just to have resources enough to meet the basic necessities of life, and a kind of callousness on the part of so many politicians and political leaders, and not to mention those who have obscene wealth, exhibiting little or no concern for the rest of us, which, by the way, seems to me to be the most unpatriotic position they could take. So I try to stand in for these issues. I think they're connected. And I think that until we sort them out and really get serious about addressing them, we will continue to have voter suppression, unfair gerrymandering, an entire underpinning of democracy being continually eroded. So I set that before us as a group to think about.
Thank you, John. I'm feeling the weight of all of this right now. Is anybody else feeling the heaviness?
It's huge. We are in such a critical moment in time. And I'm not sure that beyond our interest in who's winning and who's losing, that we actually comprehend the bigger issues here, that we actually get it, that we are on the precipice of a disaster. I really feel that deeply. That's where we are right now.
Thank you, John. And Kelly's putting in the chat, Kelly works for the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. If you're not familiar with that campaign, I lift it up to you. And she's putting some additional quotes in here that I know she lives with and works with every day in the chat for us.
Yep.
I want to pass now to Graham, who is sitting right next to me, but has his own screen because I'm greedy, I guess, about my space. But Graham also went to divinity school and doesn't get a lot of airtime in his space because I talk a lot, but has a lot of conversations with people that he went to college with and high school with and grew up with that now he's in differing views with. And so, Graham, I'd love for you just to talk a little bit about how your faith has moved you to be in the political space that you're in.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Am I supposed to say unmuted?
You're supposed to say.
That was my fault. You have to start over.
Okay. Hi, everybody. It's good to be with you. As Amanda said, I did go to seminary. Before that, I went to Baylor University, which is known for having more moderate professors. It's a Baptist university, more moderate professors, but more conservative student body. Didn't really know that at the time. But so as Amanda mentions, my best friends from Baylor are all very conservative these days. And we have strong disagreements. The 2016 election was very hard. A lot of the pain for me around that and the figuring out how to engage, Amanda and I were talking about this just yesterday, was not so much about their vote and what they did, because we've had those differences. But my inability to be able to engage was, we know now, in a sense, my own kind of code switching that I have the privilege of doing as a white person, to be somebody who has more progressive values, but then to enter into a space more conservative people and to say, okay, yeah, I guess we can't agree to disagree. But coming from myself to realize that we've seen a lot of the things being passed around about how to talk about that. We can agree to disagree about pepperoni or cheese pizza, but not about, whether it's somebody's life or not. And so for me, so that was an internal work for me to be able to not re-enter that space with them just for the sake of our friendship or something, but actually be willing to put the friendship on the line to say, this is what I believe. And I think what you believe and what your vote reflects is dangerous and wrong. And that's hard. That's hard. That's not easy. But I arrive at that place with how my faith influences me. That's the question to me, is how does my faith influence me? And this is a complicated question, right? I went to Baylor. My conservative friends, they're religious. They'll say that their faith influences them. But I think what I would say as white people of faith, that if we are trying to claim that we're voting and letting our faith inform us, then our vote, to a certain degree, should make us uncomfortable. It should not move us towards more comfort in our power. And what I mean by that is Tom mentioned earlier that white people kind of historically vote with self-interest in mind, being very individualistic. And then Jake quoted Baldwin saying that white people have to look inward how we've been damaged by white supremacy. And so a vote that makes us uncomfortable is a vote that goes against white supremacy, of being against being individualistic, against being capitalistic, against being less white. And so that's what I mean. It should make us uncomfortable, because as white people, no matter how we've been raised, we are influenced by those things. Those things grip at us, and we can't deny that. And we can't say, oh, it doesn't make me uncomfortable. I think at some level it does make us uncomfortable, because that's ingrained in us from being 6 months old, whether it's from our parents or from the world around us. And then specifically tying it not just to my faith, but back to the Bible. For me, when I look at the Bible, some of the core tenets of it are about community, what that community looks like. And then specifically to tie it in here to voting, our understanding of wealth and possessions and our relationship to them. So I think about the parable of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke. and how Lazarus ends up in heaven with God, and Lazarus down, or the rich man down in Hades, because he never gave Lazarus anything. He was too consumed with his own self-interest, his own wealth. So I look at stories like that. I look at the entire book of Acts and how that was one of the earliest communities of believers that we know about and can read about, and that they shared their possessions, not claiming anything for themselves. So modeling for us an example of, if there are 35 million people in poverty right now, there are 40 million people without health care, the wealth gap doubling between 1989 and 2016. We look at that and saying, if we need to pay more in taxes, if we need to try to create more equity, and that requires, white people who have a $30,000 difference in the wealth gap giving up more, then if you're saying our faith informs our vote, then yeah, that's what it's going to require of us. And then further kind of looking into what does that community look like? If we look at Galatians, neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, for me, that looks like being an inclusive community of race, of gender, of sexual orientation, whatever that is. And a quote I always like to come back to with this one is something that a South African Methodist bishop once told me. His name was Peter Story. And he told me once, he said, "I'd rather be judged by God for loving with my arms too wide open than too close shut." And that's always stuck with me and been very powerful and helped drive how my faith influences my vote.
Thank you, Graham. And kind of staying in this same faith and voting space, Alli and Ron, I'm going to pass to you all now. You all are down there in Atlanta, so definitely around in a much more red space than many of us who are up here in the north. And I'd love for you all to talk a little bit about your own journeys in this. I know that you have not always voted in the same way that you're going to vote in this election. And so talk to us a little bit about that journey, what inspired that journey, and also in the conversations that you're having right now, what are you hearing about people who are using their Christianity, their religion to justify a vote for Trump?
Hi, folks. I'm Murad. Pronouns he, him, his. I am a Wall Streeter whose day job is to make the ultra wealthy wealthier. So I know that should be immediately disqualifying, but this is a very graceful and gracious place. So I'll stick around a little longer. But that just means that I think I have to work even harder the rest of the time, probably make up for my contribution to what's wrong with our society and our world. I'm a recovering Republican and a recovering Seventh-day Adventist. And what's fascinating about what you're going to hear from us in this particular segment is, even though Alli's origin and mine are virtually identical, our paths have been wildly different. So let me pass it to her to talk about her journey first.
Yeah. Well, hi, everyone. It's great to be here. And this is easy and I can keep it short. I look back on my life as in 3 segments. The first 25 years of my life, I was raised conservative, Seventh-day Adventist, which is very tribal. I left the church when my parents left the church, which is a whole nother story, but we won't go into it. But my mom was always Democratic and she left that to me. So when I left everything I knew, I stuck with democracy. And then I was in Georgia, Tennessee and Georgia, the Bible Belt. And for the next 25 years of my life, it was about arguing 2 basic things, goodness and love. And I felt guilty for those 25 years because so many of us caught up in religious, conservative, traditional churches learn that there's so many parts of being in a religion. And I just felt like goodness and love was enough for me. And I was lucky because my mom influenced me and I fought through every election my whole life. What changed for me is when Trump became president, hating everything all those years leading up to that, I became just beside myself. But I didn't really have a platform. I was raising my 2 children in suburbia, white privilege America, and I would have my arguments in the nurse's station. I'm a cardiac nurse, and defend my liberal beliefs, but then live that white privilege. The last year is huge for me. Rod came into my life, and he brought me into middle. It's the first time I've been exposed to organized religion for a long time, but even more so this election. And then I watched Jackie's anti-racism workshop. She gave me just enough fuel to be dangerous at the workplace. So what I did was, because my girlfriends are Black at work and they're so close to me, I just felt like she gave me the door to open it up and lay it on the line. And every time I misspoke or said something wrong, they would jump down my throat. And then I would put Jackie on and play segments and tell them this is what I'd learned. And the end of the day, the last month has been about discussing this election openly in the workplace. And when the boss comes around, they're the ones going in discussion with him, because they know if I open my mouth, it's going to be a brawl in the workplace. So Jackie gave me the go-ahead to discuss election and racism and what this means. I felt this all my life, but never before until this. And I feel like we're running out of time, but thank goodness for Rod. He's so positive about this election. We do discuss this. We have to discuss this. We will make mistakes with white privilege. The girls at work didn't like it when I brought white privilege up to them. They didn't understand. They didn't know where I got the information. And then I was like backpedaling, and I was explaining, and I was trying to, and then when they got it, it was like a light went off. Okay, and so they've been on my side as far as trying to keep me from getting fired, basically. But there's not even a question on where, as a Christian, you should be going during this election.
So my path is very different. For those of you who don't know Seventh-day Adventism, think of it as quasi-evangelical with just a little more tribalism and a little more weirdness. But think of it generally as evangelical. So I came up in a more traditional route because I didn't have a mother who was naturally progressive. And so everyone I knew, except for Alli's mom, because her father was the principal of the boarding school we met at. So this was the only Adventist I had ever met in my young life that wasn't a Republican. And so that continued through my life because my parents didn't have an alternate view. And so I spent most of my life until Trump following the usual capitalistic, militaristic, nationalistic path that evangelicals are still on. But I had one significant advantage, and that is because of my job, which is really lending money to ultra high net worth people. I knew Donald Trump from my first day on the job. And I walked into work as a rookie private banker way back when, 1990 actually. And it was already common knowledge that this man was a crook and his character was terrible because his Atlantic City investments had already blown up and he owed Citibank hundreds of millions of dollars. And he was ultimately too big to fail. But that put him on our no-fly list. So for the last 30 years or the last 26 years until he was running for president, he was someone that no one would go anywhere near because he was just a bad person. So I was more shocked than most, I would say, when he won the nomination and ultimately was elected, because that meant that my Republican tribe and my quasi-evangelical tribe had both sold themselves out to something that I knew was evil. So it was very easy to say at that point, all right, I've got to get out of here. This can't be my tribe anymore. These can't be my tribes anymore. And so that has shoved me dramatically left on both spectrums, and it's been a very cathartic, very joyful experience, ironically, because we've all descended into purgatory here, but there are some silver linings, especially for me. And I guess the abiding observation that I've received and now will attempt to share, which most of you already appreciate, is that Jesus really meant what he said when he said, "You got to lose your life to save it." So the concept of giving yourself away, the concept of profound unselfishness, is so dramatically contrasted by this culture of selfishness, which is the most comprehensive description I can give of Trumpism. So going into an election with a simple idea that not just in this election, but every election going forward, if we're supposed to give our lives away, then certainly we should be giving our votes away. So who should we vote for? Well, we should vote for whoever is going to be most beneficial to those most disadvantaged others. And I think that should be something that is gradually infused back into Christianity, because the Christianity that has supported Trump is no Christianity at all. And it's really completely opposed to the life and teachings of Jesus. So I think that this election will turn out very well for the future of this country and the world. But then we've got a whole bunch of work to do, obviously, to bring all those former Jesus followers back in the right direction.
Rod, thank you. Odette, I see your question. Hang with it, okay? I think your hand's raised there. Yeah, I like your yellow blanket. So this has just been a powerful time of testimony and of recommitment and of laying the table for what is at stake. And I was reminded, some of you know, I had a little small spot on Fox News on Friday, and I've been reminded in the vitriol that we've received and Middle has received since that, just how divided we are, right? As a country and as a family and as a people, that we really do get in tunnel vision, and we begin to just talking with people who think and believe like we do. And there are many different times where that's appropriate, and there are some times where we just can't do that. And white people, I think, need to risk more in this space where we have the institutionalized privilege to be able to have these conversations with people that we love when we can and when it's appropriate. That is hard. And I'm not an expert, and no one here is an expert at that or at this work. But one person here does trainings along this line, and that is Jesse, another beloved member of Middle Church. So Jesse, I'll let you introduce yourself and a little bit about your background. And, you know, you usually do like in-depth days and days of this work with people. So I know I'm asking you an impossible task to give us an overview of how we can do this. So thank you for gracing us with what you can give us today.
Thank you, Amanda. It's wonderful to be part of this conversation. So it's funny, I was going to start off my little intro with, by day I do this, not a Wall Street banker, but a workplace mediator and a conflict resolution trainer. And by night, I facilitate dialogue. I've facilitated dialogue for several years with young adults in the Middle East and the West. And after the 2016 election, I started exploring how I could apply those techniques to the US political conversation, to try to have a different kind of conversation than we typically saw in the media and in government. And one of the mantras of the work of a facilitator or a mediator is to engage in dialogue, not debate. And the goal there is to build connection and humanity across difference, to help both sides hear new perspectives, to try not to convince or persuade or win an argument, as this is seen as usually leading to antagonism and doesn't tend to change minds. So the goal isn't so much to persuade as to grow our capacity for civil discourse, and perhaps see if there can be a different conversation, maybe a collaborative, creative problem solving around policy, maybe. So I met repeatedly with two different groups, politically mixed, Democrats, Republicans, sprinkle of libertarians. And I saw that it was not so hard to create a civil conversation when people came in with that goal. I saw some humanization. There were some surprises. There were some policy similarities that people weren't expecting, or different reasons for things that might have been expected. But I really didn't see anyone change their mind about anything or switch sides. So when I read the event description, and I learned I was supposed to talk about hard conversations with loved ones to move us all towards justice, I realized, oh gosh, I'm gonna have to confess, I don't know if this work is moving anyone toward justice. I've worried, and this is actually very similar to some of the concerns that Graham raised about agreeing to disagree. I've worried about legitimizing what I actually feel are immoral positions by trying to provide equal space for people to express them. And I felt dissatisfied with this idea of it's okay to agree to disagree. So for me, I think the answer is to engage in both dialogue work and activism, going to protests, doing phone banking. So with that caveat, I will share some tips around how I approach these conversations. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is self-care. And Jackie's sermon this morning really resonated with me. Conversations about politics can be painful, they can be unpleasant. Amanda mentioned the heart racing. For me, my cheeks get hot and flushed. And this is because they're touching on our deepest values, our deepest needs. And when they're with friends and family, we're combining all the challenges of political conversation with whatever dynamics might be going on in the relationship. So I think that to make these conversations anything other than unpleasant and excruciating sometimes, it's really important to acknowledge how uncomfortable they can be and direct some self-compassion, some love to those parts of yourself that might be hurting. I'm going to briefly share a slide. Let's see. Okay, here it is. All right, let's do that. Your brain on conflict. I do this in my trainings and I have to say it's a grossly oversimplified lesson, but when we are in conflict or when we're hearing political positions that we don't agree with, what's happening for us often is that we're entering into a fight, flight, freeze reaction. And this comes from our primitive brain. And when we perceive, it's as if we're perceiving a threat. And it's interesting to note that the instinctual reptilian part of our brain reacts 30 times faster than the more reflective parts of our brain, than the neocortex. And we're evolved to react in this way. It's a vital survival tool, but it's also a limited toolbox. It can escalate an argument, it can shut down a conversation. And when you react from this fight, flight, freeze place, you're more likely to elicit a defensive or angry response. I'm gonna stop sharing. So part of what we do when we train in conflict resolution is to help people try to stay centered and be able to access the more intentional, reflective, rational parts of our brain so that we can listen and we can express our thoughts and emotions in a way that might be more accessible and less threatening to others. So I'd like to invite you to participate in a short little exercise. If you could get comfortable, you can even turn off your camera for a minute if you want to, but promise you'll turn it back on. feel your feet on the floor, your seat on your seat, and maybe close your eyes. Or just soften your gaze. And let's feel the breath coming in and out of our bodies. You might feel your abdomen expanding as the air enters your body. You might find that your breath is slow and steady. It might be short, unsteady like mine is right now because I'm speaking in front of all of you. And I'd like you to bring to mind a conversation with a family member or a close friend that you disagree with politically, someone who plans to vote for Trump, maybe someone like a family member I recently spoke with, partly in preparation for this conversation, who told me that she was pleasantly surprised by the past 4 years of Trump. This could be a conversation you had. It could be a conversation you think you should have before Election Day. So what's coming up for you? Note to yourself. Note any sensations in your body. Where do you feel it in your body? Note any feelings that arise. When you experience an emotion or a sensation in your body that indicates that your nervous system is activated in some way, it means that you have a need that is either being met or it's not being met. So if you're experiencing well-being, joy, affection, excitement, hope, your needs for connection, for meaning or purpose, for love, for safety, for physical well-being, those are being met. If you're experiencing anger, fear, anxiety, there's something that's not being met. There's a very universal human need there that's not being met. So ask yourself, when you're thinking about this conversation, what needs are coming up for me? If you feel a sense of threat or like you have to protect yourself, what are you trying to protect? What values are at stake? And once you've been able to name some of that, hold those parts of you, those parts that seek protection, your need for love or well-being. Really cradle these parts of yourself. This is your humanity. No matter what's happening at the surface of a conflict. So when you're ready, let's bring our awareness back to our breath for a moment. And this time, let's take some intentionally deep breaths, because this helps to calm the nervous system. So let's draw the air all the way from the root of our abdomen into our bodies. Blow it out fully. And let it enter our bodies again. All right, thank you, everyone. And if you're game to turn your camera back on, you can go ahead and do that now. I hope that this exercise in compassion for yourself during these conversations can be a touchstone to both to make it less painful and also to keep you calm and make you actually more effective in having these conversations. So I'm going to go back to, and I would love, usually when I do this, we have time for debriefing. And so we're not going to do that right now, but I know it can bring up a lot. So I'm holding that. So I'm going to go back to screen sharing and share with you some tips I developed primarily for facilitators of conversation, but I tweaked them a little bit. So I thought we could use them in this context as well as engaging directly in conversations. Okay, I just tried to advance the slide and it beeped at me. Why is that? Let's see, okay. So tip number 2, because tip number 1 was self-care. Tip number 2 is build relationships, have empathy, build empathy between the person you're in conversation with. And with family, some of that is quite possibly already there. But I think that even with family, you don't necessarily want to dive into the conversation. It shouldn't necessarily be the only reason that you want to speak to this person to try to change their mind before election day. Any kind of human connection that you can establish. And also even the environment, if you can be in a good environment, that actually can really change how a conversation feels. The next tip is aim for dialogue, not debate. And I talked about this a little bit in the beginning, but if you set out trying to win an argument, you're likely going to engender a lot of pushback. So dialogue instead is that mutual exchange of perspectives. And one way to do this is to try to understand why the other person feels the way they do, not just what they're saying. And we could talk in much greater detail, but just going through a bit of a list here. So active listening is a really important part of dialogue. And there's a little acronym you can use to help you remember different elements of it. We talked a bit about empathy. And this can be expressed in body language, in tone. You rarely want to say, like, I hear that you're feeling angry, right? Because that just sounds stupid. But you could say, it sounds like such and such has been really frustrating for you. Or that issue sounds really important to you. Can you help me understand why? Which brings us to asking questions, which is really key in trying to build understanding. So you might ask, especially I think when you hear something that seems completely off the wall to you or really angering or upsetting, instead of going immediately to your rebuttal, ask a question first. Ask, can you tell me more about that? Why do you believe that? Can you help me understand? And then instead of jumping right to your rebuttals, there'll be a chance for that too. But, oh, sorry, I'm skipping ahead. Oh, maybe I'm not. Oh yeah, just another thing on listening is that when you're demonstrating that you understand where someone's coming from, it doesn't mean you're saying that you agree with them. I think sometimes people feel that if they admit that they understand or they're trying to understand what someone says, it's almost like they're ceding ground. But what I try to do is create an environment where we can understand one another while still maintaining our own positions. So I'm going to skip back to this for a second. So once you've asked some questions, you've empathized, you can reflect back a little bit what you hear. So if you're speaking, as I did recently on a phone banking call, you're speaking with a small business owner who's worried that their taxes are going to go up. Instead of arguing the fine points about the tax policy, at first I might say, I understand that you're worried that taxes are going to go up with Biden and you're really concerned about the survival of your business. Or you might reframe something. So if someone says, immigrants are stealing our jobs, you could reframe this in a way that hits on what's really important to them. It sounds like job security is really important to you. And you can summarize some of what you've heard, both so that the person you're speaking to knows that you were listening, and also so you can check your understanding. And you can ask, did I get that right? No? Am I missing something? What am I missing? And do that until you feel like you really understand. And then it might be time to share your view. And ideally, and I've seen this work sometimes, If you demonstrate that kind of listening, you're more likely to get it in return. All right, we talked about that. Make it personal. I think often these kinds of conversations are more effective when we move from the abstract policy debate, intellectual debate to personal stories. How do these policies impact you? How do the other person feel like it impacts them? Hold space for and normalize emotion. That might be facilitator speak a little bit, but the point is that it's totally natural that emotions are going to be running high in these conversations. And passion itself is not, it shouldn't be the problem, it's appropriate. You know, like Graham was saying, we should feel strongly about these issues. But I'll quote one of my favorite mediators and writers, Ken Cloak, who said, rather than ask how to make discourse more civil or polite, let's ask how we can transform political passions and turn them into problem solving. It's a lofty goal, but something to keep in mind. So tip number 6 is listen for and highlight underlying values and interests. When we did our meditation, I mentioned underneath everything you're feeling, there's an underlying interest, there's a need that's trying to be met. So this is about trying to understand why people are saying what they're saying, what's motivating them. Maybe there are some common values, maybe not. But you can ask, what's at the heart of this for you? Or I'm hearing that we both value such and such, but we have different ideas about the best way to achieve it. And I think especially when emotions are running high, it's important to try to understand what's motivating where people are coming from. Because when the emotions are high, it's when there's something really important going on. So well, first of all, actually, how am I doing on time? I have a little while.
Yeah, you're fine, Jesse. If you can go
Okay.
maybe 2 or 3 more minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A.
Okay.
Is that
Cool.
possible?
Yeah, that works. No, it totally works. Yeah. I only have 7 tips and we're already on 6. Oh, wait, I'm going to share my screen. Again, one more time. I just want to show you a slide. There it is. Yeah, so this is another way to think about positions and interests. So a position in a workplace context, I want my desk over there only. Okay, why is that important to you? Is it because of natural light? Is it because you need privacy or quiet? Once you understand why someone wants something, you may find some other ways of meeting that need. So underneath any policy position or opinion, there are experiences, assumptions, biases, values, needs. So part of this dialogue is uncovering some of that. So if we were to take healthcare as an example, let's see. So for those of you who want to save or expand the Affordable Care Act or institute Medicare for All, what are some of the underlying interests, needs, or values that motivate that position that you're taking? Could you type them in the chat box? Why do we want to save Obamacare? Nobody wants to save Obamacare? Here we go. Let's see, more equitable access, equity, and access to
Really
healthcare.
private message someone, that was very weird.
Right, it won't be replaced by something better. Potential for care for all. And if we go even a little deeper than that, well-being, physical well-being, safety, security. And what about someone who wants to repeal the Affordable Care Act? What underlying needs or interests might motivate that position? Finances. Okay. So on some level, we can interpret finances as security, well-being, desire for efficiency, for a better way. A feeling of scarcity. If everyone has it, then what I have will be less valuable. Great. All right. Thanks. Thanks for sharing some thoughts. Worried about socialism. Right. And then we could dig under that. What's this concern about socialism? What's at stake here? Great. Fear of oppressive bureaucracy. Okay. All right. We can unpack this a lot more, but I'm going to move on to my last tip. Let's see. How do I move through stuck arguments? So I really just have two examples. It's a huge topic, but one example I thought of was this: when you disagree about facts, what to do about that. One thing you could do is acknowledge that you might not get clear on all the facts in this moment. And acknowledge that limitation, and instead try to talk about those underlying values and interests that's motivating the discussion. You can also try to find out where did you get that information? Can you share that with me? Oh, here's where I got my information. In some of the political dialogue groups that I've facilitated, I've encouraged people to do a media swap and read one another's media over the course of a week or two, and then come back and talk about it. And then the question of labels, and I kind of wrote a shorthand, like, this person is racist, this person is sexist, this person is stupid. I think we should absolutely name racism and privilege and sexism when we see it. But at the same time, those words can engender a lot of defensiveness, and it may be helpful to, after you've named it, to focus more on the meaning, on the action, on the impact, rather than the label or the person. So instead of, if you're talking about Trump's policies at the border, sorry, actually, that's not the example I'm going to use. Let's say, if you're discussing whether or not it's racist to use the term Kung flu, when Trump says that, instead of talking about that, you could talk about the fact that hate crimes against Asian Americans has been on the rise since the pandemic. So that way you're focusing it on the impact and how this policy, or this, that's not a policy, but how this rhetoric is hurting people. So those are my tips in a nutshell. And I'll pass it back to you, Amanda. And I should probably make you host again, right?
Sure, thank you. Jesse, thank you so much for that brief overview. And I'm sure people have questions for you specifically. And before we just open it up to general questions, Jesse, is there ever something that you would say, yeah, if that happens, maybe that's not going to be a person that's interested in dialogue? Or like, can you just speak a little bit about that's maybe not worth your energy?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably listen to your gut on that. And if the person only wants to win that argument, if there's no reciprocal interest in having a conversation, then it's probably not worth your time.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jesse. Friends, I want to make sure everybody that's here can feel like they can say something if there's something that they want to say, and specifically if there's questions about anything that you've heard from anybody who's spoken today. You can either put it in the chat and I can ask it, or you can unmute yourself and ask. Actually, first, do you mind, let's just take a minute and put some questions in the chat so I can just kind of gauge, because we only have about 10 minutes left, and then I'll kind of group them and call them out. So if we can type questions in the chat, that might be easiest. And if there's not a lot, then you can ask it. But if there is a lot, I want to find the best way to do it. Odette, I know you had one earlier.
I didn't have a question. I was just giving the Statue of Liberty salute to his comment. Sorry. I confused you. Right.
Okay, yeah. I thought you were saying the question. Okay, so the questions aren't coming in super quick, so that means that if you want to add something to the conversation, yeah, just go ahead and unmute yourself. And I see Tony did put one in. Drew, you go ahead, then we'll go to Tony.
I was trying to type it in, but it'll be easier if I just ask it this way. So, I have a lot of questions. This is maybe for Graham, maybe for Alli, for Rod. I missed your first thing, Amanda, so it might be for you too. But what are some ideas, or what have you found that works when you're moving into a conversation with other Christians who the conversation turns from the issues into them moving away from thinking that we should actually invest in seeing government make these policy changes, when it goes in this this is something that's an individual responsibility. We should be the ones that are finding ways to give our money to other organizations, as opposed to hoping that we could actually make the system better. That seems like a difficult dichotomy for me, and I'm wondering what you guys think about that. Raised very conservatively, near fundamental, Midwest Kansas. So that's where some of my conversations are coming from.
I'm happy to. Oh, are you on? I'm happy to take a first stab at that. I think one thing to keep in mind is a lot of the stuff that Jesse just went through, and also through the lens that change or a shifting of mindset on a particular issue is not going to happen in one conversation. I think that's where the value of the human connection and the relationship and trust is not built in one conversation. So I think one lens to look at it is, if it comes to a certain issue and there's that point that you can't get through, just try to pick out that one thing that you want to give them something to walk away and think about. And then in that next conversation to revisit it. So for me, with my conservative friends, when things would always be brought up, I would always bring things back to real stories that I'm reading in the news as it relates to children in cages at the border, or when it comes to like the issue about abortion, about, have you ever thought about the statistics of how it's a racialized thing, not just something that we can think about with our faith, and give them something to think about and marinate on. And oftentimes having to bring it up over and over, sometimes I can maybe try to cement us in our views, but just trying different tactics of ways in, but still always recognizing that change happens in increments. And remembering what Jesse said, that first reaction of somebody's probably going to be defensive and to shut it off. And to not listen to it, but just to try to keep revisiting that.
And I may just jump in because I on your question. Sorry, I was just trying to locate it again in the chat so I could get.
It was Drew, and he said it out loud. I don't think it's in the chat.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, it's about the difference between how to speak with folks who want to turn anything talking about political ideas into saying we shouldn't be trying to change the system anyway. It's all an individual responsibility conversation.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I was looking at Tony's question in the chat. So
That's okay. You can answer Tony's question. That's fine too.
Well, let me jump in on this one for just a second. I think there's something very fundamental here that maybe can't be quickly rectified, but the American belief is that capitalism is a tenet of the gospel, right? Christianity and capitalism and small government are all the American way, which is the Christian way, because it's all subsumed together. So I think an interesting thing to ask them is why why they believe that capitalism is essential to a Christian nation, and how the tenets of capitalism relate to the teachings of Jesus. Because I think there's so much about it that is diametrically opposed, and that's really the conversation we need to start to have. But there's something that is assumed to be profoundly and permanently American and Christian about capitalism, and it's just false.
Thank you all. There's a lot of other good questions in the chat, so I'm just going to read them out loud, and then anybody can feel free to jump in. Tony asks, any suggestions for speaking with loved ones who are voting for Biden, but are really hoping that doing so will make things like racial unrest just go away, so that we don't have to continue to think about racism?
I'll jump in on that one because that was the one I was looking at earlier. Sorry, I thought it was Drew's as well. But I think, and I don't really have a clear answer to that, but I have a couple things that I want to say. I think earlier I said something that sounded a lot like that the vote for Biden-Harris would like make racism go away more quickly. But hearing Graham talk about how, the white, as a white person voting for Biden-Harris, is actually the more uncomfortable move, because that puts your whiteness and your white identity on the line a little bit more. So, and I think that that's correct. I think that voting for Biden-Harris because you feel uncomfortable about racism and racial unrest and you want it to go away, it's not going to go. The vote for Biden-Harris is going to be better, I think, in furthering that conversation, precisely because it puts the spotlight on that conversation and doesn't repress it. Sort of relatedly, one thing I want to put on the table as well that I've been trying to think through is the difference between being anti-Trump and pro-Biden. And I think it's, I'm obviously really anti-Trump, and at the same time, I want to look at what it means to be pro-Biden-Harris, because I think there are really positive values that they're setting forth. And I think it's important to not let the Trump line set the standard for what we're talking about. I think Bernie himself, I think Noam Chomsky, I think Angela Davis have said that Biden's platform, if he manages to get everything passed, is one of the most progressive since Roosevelt. So even though he pitches himself middle of the line, I mean, I think there are a lot of good things there. So I'll be quiet there, but I don't think that was really an answer to the question, but.
I'm going to speak up one last second. I know we're running out of time. We cannot forget what's happened over the last few months with Black Lives Matter and our goal coming out of this election, which we are going to win. We need to stay focused on what is important. We are going to win this election, and then we got to deal with absolutely equality and taking, Jackie mentioned the rungs of a ladder. I don't want to see a ladder in the room.
I love that. Sally, I don't know if you're comfortable with me putting you on the spot for a minute, but I thought you might provide some insight into this continual work that we have to do, that really kind of, no matter who wins, is still before us.
Yes. Thanks for the passing of the mic. I was going to add to Tony's question, any suggestions for speaking with loved ones who are voting for Biden thinking that racism is just going to go away. Racism is not going to go away until whoever is asking that question starts doing the work. And even then, it's not going to go away. So I think it's an inherently flawed question. And it has, if we leave the solution to ending racism to politicians, we're screwed. So I think that it's about reframing that question to begin with. And it's on all of us as white folks to do the self-reflection, I like to say, these uprisings and white supremacy is absolutely heartbreaking as a a white person who's kind of awakening to the movement. However, it's not until your heart is broken wide open, I think, as a white person, it's not until that point that you can actually see that something is wrong, and you choose to do the work, which is, I'm sure you've heard this before, but anti-racism work is hourly. It's minute by minute even. So this notion of voting for somebody, hoping that racism is going to go away is just missing the mark completely, because it's such an independent and internal study first. And until, white folks as a collective do that work, we ain't going to get anywhere.
Amanda, can I offer a comment briefly?
Yes, please.
This election will take place in a little over a week. And we need to recognize that whoever wins, our current circumstances are pretty much going to remain in front of us to be dealt with. If Biden is elected, it will be incumbent upon the movement to hold his feet to the fire, to continue to galvanize the population around the issues that are in front of us, while at the same time, which is the tricky part, attempting to narrow the gap of division in this country. And so that is no easy balancing act. But I think until we find a way, I've asked myself the question, is common ground an illusion? Is there common ground? Or are we just, caught up in a fantasy? I think there is common ground. And I think listening is a key to finding the common ground, and helping people see that articulating what their core values are and what their vision is for this country gives us a starting point. I'd like to start with the question, what's your vision for this country? Because it leads people first to a pause, because they've never been asked that question before. But secondly, it leads them into going a little deeper beyond the sort of win-lose proposition that's before us. It's not a bad question to ask, by the way, at the family Thanksgiving table. Instead of starting with who did you vote for? What's your vision for the country? Your vision for us as a people. Where are we going? And what is your hope for the legacy we will leave behind as a generation to the next generation? These are really important questions for me. And I think have the capacity to draw us a little closer in conversation rather than be constantly embattled around the divisions that are operative now. The other thing that hasn't been mentioned, I want to mention, and that is the media. All of the media that's operative, that invades our space and our time and comes through the airwaves, or we see on the television. The media is a co-conspirator in the division. They are active because it sells. Just let me end the sentence there. And so we need to step into that arena and insist that media be seen as not just simply a First Amendment right, but it has responsibilities. And we need to call attention to that and have people more articulate than me to tackle that issue. But right now, it's running wild and is destructive more so than constructive. And it is continuing, I think, on a path that's going to make it tough for us to come together. Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you, John. And thank you all so much. I feel like we could keep talking here for a long time. And one of the goals when John and I first were brainstorming about this is also just to say that we don't want us to feel isolated in this. Not like we need to have our hands completely held. You know, we all recognize that we have much different privilege than just walking around white. But this is still hard. These conversations are still hard because, as Jesse said, these are values that we hold, and they're usually conversations with people that we love. And so it is helpful to one, you know, show that we are not afraid to talk about our whiteness and how we are raised and how we understand that we have a specific role to play in this election, because this election has a specific role to play in whether or not this country reflects the vision that God has for us, that we all know that we want and that we're working for. Jesse, I see a lot of these questions here at the end are really around kind of some more of this conversation stuff. So if you and I can kind of just maybe make note of the chat, and then I may have you just give some responses that we can email out to everybody, if that feels okay with you, or I can connect you to people, whatever seems to work best. Okay. But I do want to be respectful and mindful of everyone's time. And thank you again. I know that this is a very heavy and yet hopeful election stretch that we are in. When I send a follow-up email to this call, I'll also give just a couple of other actions to lift up, including a prayer vigil. We are people that believe in the power of prayer, yes. Middle Church is hosting a 12-hour prayer vigil on the day before the election day. And everyone is welcome to watch that. It'll be live streamed on our Facebook page. And if you'd like to hold 15 minutes of a prayer time, you're welcome to sign up and hold a prayer space, whatever that looks like for you. And then also, I'll just lift up one other event verbally before I email them out. Skylar's waving hello to everyone. If you'd like to wave to her, she knows some of your faces, so it's nice for her to see you. Middle Church is also holding tomorrow night a pole chaplaincy training. You do not have to be a chaplain. You don't have to be a reverend. You have to be a nice person to come. You also don't have to be in New York to come to that. But it's just a recognition that these lines are long out there, no matter where you live in the world. And we want people to stay in line. We want people to vote, and we want to show up with, if we're able to, based on our ability with COVID and everything else, if we're able to show up in person and de-escalate and show kindness. Tomorrow night, we'll give you some great tips on doing that. So that'll be in the follow-up email as well. And just a big round of applause for John and Tommy, if he's still here. I think he's gone. And Jesse and Graham and Jake and who else? That was, Alli and Rod. Thank you so much, you all, for for being vulnerable and just speaking about your experience in this work. And as we go with God's grace and with God's peace, and with our recommitment and recognition that this is only part of the work and not a replacement of multi-ethnic and multiracial dialogue.
And the next time we meet, Amanda will be serving cookies and ice cream. So.
No, let's hope so.
Okay.
Let's hope so. Have a great day, everybody. It's good to see you.
Bye. Thanks, Amanda.
Now let's see if I can save this chat.